In 10 years of living in the city, there was one thing Cole had never once heard his grandfather complain about: losing livestock. While the neighbors kept getting hit hard by cattle, sheep, and hunting dogs being dragged off by predators, Gerald Whitaker's ranch in Montana stayed untouched. Not a single loss in 38 years. Cole had always assumed it was luck, until the day his grandfather died and left behind an old, worn brown notebook with a note written in red ink, underlined 3 times. Friday night, Half Moon Rock, fresh venison, do not be late, do not miss it. 38 years, not 1 week skipped. That was not luck, that was a bargain. But Cole brushed it off as ridiculous superstition and decided to stop. And 3 weeks later, Cole finally understood why his grandfather had never missed a single Friday night, after seeing, with his own eyes, the arrival of a massive creature people often call Sasquatch. Tonight's story is told in the spirit of old forest legends, encounters whispered across generations, and the kind of fear that only truly begins when the entire woods suddenly go quiet. If you were Cole, would you keep this bargain going or stop it? Comment below. And if you believe Bigfoot is hiding out there somewhere, don't forget to leave the name of the city where you live. Hello, I'm Victor from Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Hit subscribe, and let's uncover the secret of the Whitaker family together. Cole Whitaker got the news that his grandfather had died on a September morning while he was standing in the middle of a construction site in Missoula, holding drainage plans for a new housing development. The caller was the family attorney, his voice even and polite. Gerald Whitaker had passed away at 4:12 a.m. after spending the summer in bed inside the old log house at the foot of the Bitterroot Range. Cole stood still beside a running cement mixer, listening to the engine swallow half the words coming through the phone. He looked down at his work boots, filmed with cement dust, and realized the first thing he felt wasn't clean grief. It felt more like a missing piece. A nail had just dropped out of an old wall, and the room hadn't had time to lean yet. He had no plan to go back to the ranch. In 10 years of living in Missoula, Cole had grown used to painted traffic lines, meeting schedules, CAD drawings, rent bills, early morning gym sessions, and coffee bought from the shop on the corner. The Whitaker Ranch belonged to a different part of his life. Childhood summers, the smell of hay, sheep calling before daylight, Gerald's hand on his shoulder, heavy as something real in this world. But that part of his life had closed a long time ago, or at least that was what Cole had been telling himself. Gerald's will was shorter than Cole expected. 300 acres of old forest at the base of the Bitterroots, a 2-story log house that had needed a new roof since last year. The remaining sheep, after the hired hands had been caring for them, some old ranch equipment, a 1994 Ford pickup that would still run if you knew how to sweet-talk the engine, and a brown notebook in the top drawer of the desk. Cole was the only person in the family empty enough to take the ranch. His sister had 3 kids and a mortgage in Spokane. His uncle in Idaho had not spoken to Gerald in nearly 7 years. Cole had no wife, no children, and a job flexible enough to work remotely for a few months if he had to. Gerald had chosen the person with the fewest things pulling him away. He drove south on Thursday afternoon. The farther he got from Missoula, the narrower the road became, and the signs slowly turned into wooden fences, pasture land, leaning power poles, and low clouds caught on the mountain slopes. The Bitterroot Range appeared in the distance, blue-gray and still. Cole rolled down the window. The air smelled of Douglas fir, dry soil, and grass yellowed at the edges by late-season sun. The Whitaker Ranch sat between an open valley and the national forest to the west. 300 acres wasn't large by Montana standards, but it was more than enough land for one person to struggle with. A small creek ran along the eastern side, shallow and full of round stones, the place where Cole used to wade for frogs when he was 8. To the north were the sheep barn and hay shed. To the south was a line of fence Gerald had built by hand, every post a little crooked, but still standing after 30 winters. The western edge was where Cole's eyes kept being pulled, even though he didn't want to admit it. That was where the ranch met the Douglas fir forest. The trees grew close together, dark trunks, high crowns holding the evening light above them like a thick ceiling. Just before the tree line stood a large, half-moon-shaped rock rising out of the grass, its top strangely flat, almost as wide as a six-person dining table. When Cole was little, he called it the Giant's Table. His grandfather only told him not to climb on it. Every Friday, Gerald placed food on that rock. It was one of those things no one in the family asked about after a while. Fresh venison, wrapped in wax paper, sometimes apples, pears, plums, or whatever fruit was in season. Gerald did it with the same ordinary manner he had when checking the barn locks or filling the water trough. Cole had asked once when he was 9. Gerald gave a short answer: rent. At the time, Cole thought it was one of those old man jokes. Then he forgot about it, the way children forget things adults don't want to explain yet. The log house was darker than he remembered. Dust lay along the window sills. Gerald's armchair was still turned toward the fireplace. In the kitchen, the wall calendar had stopped in July, several dates circled in red pen. Cole set his bag down and walked through each room with the uneasy feeling of someone inheriting a life that still had fingerprints on it. Gerald's coat hung behind the door. A blue enamel mug sat upside down beside the sink. On the dining table lay an apple knife, its blade gone dull. The small office sat behind the stairs, barely large enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and one window facing straight toward the western woods. Cole opened the top drawer almost immediately. The brown notebook lay in the middle, beneath a carpenter's pencil and an empty ammunition box. The cover was plain, untitled, the leather corners worn down. He picked it up and found it heavier than its size should have been. The first pages almost made Cole laugh, because they were exactly Gerald. Short notes, practical, no decoration. Replace north gate hinge before snow. Sheep number 18 limping, check hoof. 2 days of rain, creek up 6 inches. Dale doing good work, raise pay next month. Gerald's handwriting leaned to the right, the strokes firm. Black ink filled most of the notebook, steady as the rhythm of ranch life. Then on page 17, red ink appeared. Cole stopped because the color struck the eye like dried blood on old paper. The entry was dated November 1986, the year Gerald bought the land. It was still his handwriting, but the strokes were heavier, and it looked like he had written it slowly. Friday, Half Moon Rock. Fresh deer, no less than 15 pounds. Seasonal fruit. Do not be late. Do not miss it. The final line was underlined 3 times. Cole read it again, his mouth lifting slightly on reflex, the way people react when something is both absurd and much too serious. He turned the page, expecting an explanation right after it. There were only notes about fence lines, veterinary medicine, hay prices. The red ink disappeared, then came back 7 pages later. Heavy rain Friday still brought it out before sunset, prints around the rock deeper than usual. He sat down in Gerald's chair. The wood creaked softly under his weight. Outside the window, evening was draining from the pasture, the shadow of the woods lengthening by inches like slow spreading water. In that moment, Gerald's small office felt closer to the forest than any room Cole had ever entered in his life. Cole kept turning pages. The red notes did not appear on a fixed schedule, but they were present in every year. Some years had only a few lines, some had more, especially during winters with heavy snow or months when wolves were seen near the valley. 1992. Wolves west. Didn't enter our land. Good. 1998. Late Friday because of storm. Rock was empty in the morning. Sheep panicked. Don't let that happen again. 2003. Kendall lost 12 cattle in 1 week. We lost none. Cole knew the Kendall place. That ranch was less than 3 miles away and had been sold to a logging company years ago. As a kid, he remembered adults talking about a strange season of lost cattle, but the story had been folded into the words, hungry wolves, and sunk away like so many rural stories do. He read faster, then slower. 2010. Wrist hurting, but still took it myself. Don't give this job to anyone who doesn't understand. 2015. This is the 30th year. The bargain still holds. The word bargain made Cole lean back in the chair. He could accept an old man's superstition. He could accept a few strange lines in a notebook. But Gerald Whitaker was not the kind of man who used a word like bargain lightly. Gerald had once repaired a barn roof in January snow because he didn't trust a hired man to do it right. He had refused to buy tire insurance because he called it a scare tactic for city people. He had told Cole that if something couldn't be weighed, measured, or fixed with a wrench, you ought to doubt it before you believed it. That man had written in red ink for 38 years about the Half Moon Rock. The last entry with red ink sat near the back of the notebook, dated July of this year. The handwriting shook more, and in several places the ink had gathered into tiny dark dots. Cole read it beneath the old desk lamp, listening to the wind outside the wall. Cole will come back. Leave this notebook for him. Make sure he understands the Half Moon Rock matters more than anything else on this land. He read that sentence 3 times, the first time with curiosity, the second with irritation, the third time cold touched the back of his neck. Gerald had known he was dying when he wrote that line. He had thought about the sheep, the paperwork, the roof, the water line. After all of that, the thing he left behind in red ink was still the rock at the edge of the woods. Cole set the notebook on the desk, but his hand kept holding the edge of the cover. He looked out the window. The Half Moon Rock had become a dark gray mass between the grass and the trees. Behind it, the Douglas fir trunks stood in a dense row, darker than the sky. Something in that arrangement made him uneasy. The house, the pasture, the rock, then the forest, as if the ranch did not end at the fence line, but at some rule he had not been taught. He reminded himself that he was an engineer. Land had legal boundaries. A ranch had plat maps. National forests had signs, regulations, parcel numbers, and management records. People created those things to prevent confusion. And yet Gerald, the most practical man Cole had ever known, had left behind a notebook saying the most important thing on the land was not the barns, not the water source, not even the deed. It was a rock. In the kitchen, the old refrigerator kicked on and started to shake. The small sound made Cole flinch. He closed the notebook, stood, and went out to the back porch. The September wind moved through the dry grass. The sheep gathered near the barn, their white wool dull in the fading light. Farther out, the Half Moon Rock lay still. Nothing sat on its surface, but Cole suddenly imagined venison wrapped in wax paper, fruit arranged beside it, Gerald's wrinkled hands placing them there every Friday for almost 40 years. He did not know whether he was inheriting a ranch or a debt. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for him at the edge of the woods before he ever drove through the gate. The first month at the Whitaker Ranch passed in small tasks, the kind that made Cole feel like he still had control over his life. He did not think of it as coming home. In his mind, this was only a transition period after Gerald's death, a temporary pause before he decided whether to sell, lease the place long-term, or keep it as an investment. Any of those words felt easier than inheritance, because inheritance sounded like a dead hand still resting on his shoulder. On the first morning, Cole walked through the house with his own notebook and a black pen. He wrote down every item: the south side of the roof sagging, gutters clogged with pine needles, the well pump running too loud, the north gate hanging off its hinges, wiring in the shed needing new insulation. The sheep barn was still usable, but the floor was damp. 3 stretches of the eastern fence sagged low, and if snow came early, that would be trouble. He turned all of it into a 2-page numbered list, then started making calls. In Missoula, a list like that meant normal work. Call the roofer, schedule an inspection, get a quote, compare costs, set a date. The ranch moved slower. The roofer said next week, if the weather allowed. The pump repairman said he'd stop by once his truck was done with a job near Hamilton. The hay seller asked if Cole was Gerald's grandson and then went quiet for a few seconds, as if that name required a different kind of answer. Cole began relearning the delays of this place. He hired one more part-time hand to help with the sheep, a young man named Mason from Derby. The long-time hand, Dale Perry, stayed on, at least then. Dale was 70, narrow-shouldered but strong in the hands, with a patchy white beard and eyes that always seemed to be listening to the weather before they looked at it. He had worked for Gerald for 12 years, slept in the little room behind the hay shed during busy stretches, knew the names of every herding dog and the bad habit of every wooden gate. The day Cole met Dale, the old man was standing outside the barn, his knit cap pulled low, repairing a latch with a piece of wire. Cole held out his hand and said he wanted to systematize the ranch operation. Dale shook his hand, his palm rough as bark, then asked, "You read Mr. Gerald's notebook yet?" Cole said he had. Dale looked at him for another beat, then nodded. That question should have stayed longer in Cole's mind. But that day, he had too much to do. A hay truck showed up late. The well pump cut out halfway through the afternoon. 3 herding dogs chased each other and knocked over a toolbox. By evening, when Cole had crossed 4 items off the list, he felt the familiar satisfaction of a project beginning to take shape. The first Friday came faster than he expected. That morning, Dale placed a wax paper package on the kitchen table. Inside was fresh venison, cut into large pieces. Beside it sat a bag of red apples and a few late-season pears. Cole looked at the meat, then looked at Dale. The old man only said Gerald usually carried it out before the sun touched the tops of the western firs. Then he walked back into the yard as if he had just reminded Cole when to feed the chickens. Cole stood in the kitchen for a while, one hand braced against the edge of the table. He had thought maybe he would ignore it from the beginning, treat it as one of those strange rituals that should end with Gerald's generation. But the red ink in the notebook was still fresh in his mind, and the loss was still close. During the first week, people often follow the dead more out of grief than belief. Near sunset, he carried the meat and the bag of fruit out to the half-moon rock. Late-season grass brushed against his pants. The Douglas fir forest to the west stood dark and dense, with small birds and wind somewhere inside it. The rock was cold when he set the meat on the flat surface. He arranged the apples and pears beside it, feeling clumsy, like a person imitating a religious gesture without knowing the prayer. He stepped back and looked at everything for a few seconds. Venison, fruit, stone, woods. The scene made him feel almost foolish, but the laugh caught somewhere in his throat. Cole walked back to the house before full dark. The next morning, the meat and fruit were gone. The surface of the rock was clean, except for a few dark, damp marks. He found no bones, no wax paper, no drag trail. He told himself a bear, a fox, wolves, crows, anything living out here could handle food overnight. By the second week, grief moved back and gave way to the spreadsheet. Cole sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, black coffee, and bills. He entered the cost of hay, veterinary medicine, electricity, diesel, pump maintenance, Dale's wages, Mason's wages, roof repairs, fence repairs. The ranch Gerald left behind had valuable land, but bad cash flow. The sheep flock was smaller than it needed to be to turn a steady profit. The equipment was old, the house was old, the barn was old. Every number told him this place had to be managed tighter. Then he reached the line for food for the rock. 15 pounds of fresh venison every week. Seasonal fruit, 52 weeks a year. The time to prepare it, carry it out, come back. If he bought the meat instead of getting it through one of Gerald's hunting contacts, the cost went higher. The number wasn't enough to bankrupt anyone. It just sat inside the spreadsheet like a bent nail, small but irritating because it did not belong in the structure. Cole looked at that line longer than any other. He opened Gerald's brown notebook again, this time in a different state of mind. During the first week, he had read it like a grandson looking for his grandfather's voice in old paper. During the second, he read it like a property manager. The red ink lines lost some of their sacred feeling when set beside roof quotes and diesel receipts. Do not be late. Do not miss it. Wolves west. Didn't enter our land. The bargain still holds. Cole turned page after page, searching for a cause, some sign of the first event. There was none. Only a repeated command. On Friday afternoon, Dale did not mention anything. That surprised Cole a little. The old man worked outside the barn, shoulders bent into the wind. Mason left early. In the refrigerator, there was still venison Dale had prepared the day before, wrapped in wax paper. Apples sat on the shelf. Everything was ready enough that Cole only had to pick it up and carry it out. He stood in front of the refrigerator, listening to the compressor hum, then closed the door. He did not go to the rock. Instead, Cole sat in the living room with the lights half off, laptop open on his knees, though his eyes did not hold on to a single word. The wall clock made dry clicks. 6 o'clock. 6:30. 7. Outside the window, the western woods sank into darkness. The 3 herding dogs lay on the front porch, sometimes lifting their heads toward the wind, then lowering their muzzles back onto their paws. The sheep were quiet in the barn. Cole waited for something he both believed would not happen and resented himself for waiting for. Modern people can be arrogant in a very quiet way. They want to break old rituals, but still sit and watch to see whether the ritual will punish them. That night, Cole was exactly that kind of man. He did not name the worry, he only let it sit with him in the living room. At 10, he checked the doors. At midnight, he stepped onto the porch with a flashlight. The grass was wet. The rock in the distance was only a low black shape. No footsteps, no moving shadow. The wind carried the smell of pine and sheep manure from the barn. He gave a quiet laugh, and this time the sound came out. It sounded thin and a little false in the night. On Saturday morning, everything was intact. Cole counted the sheep with Dale. Full count. No broken fence. The dogs stretched out in front of the barn gate, lazy under the pale sun. The surface of the half-moon rock was empty, same as the day before. Dale did not ask about the venison. He only looked at the rock once, just long enough for Cole to notice, then turned away. Cole went inside and took out his own notebook. He opened to a new page and wrote, Week 1 without offering. Normal. He used black ink. His handwriting was straight, clean, the kind of writing that belonged to a man used to construction site reports. When he finished, he sat looking at the line for a while. It made him feel lighter. Just one short sentence, but it felt like setting a steel beam into soft ground. The next week, he worked harder. The roofer came to inspect the house and concluded the south side had to be replaced before snow. The pump repairman changed a valve assembly and told him he should buy a whole new unit if he wanted to stop suffering every month. Mason was useful, though he was young and played music too loud in the shed. Dale stayed quiet. Cole crossed more items off the list, ordered materials, reworked the spreadsheet. The ranch slowly became a large but clear problem. By the third Friday, no venison had been prepared. Cole decided that was better. If it wasn't prepared, he didn't have to stand in front of the refrigerator and decide all over again. That afternoon, he drove into town for parts and deliberately came home later than usual. When the pickup turned onto the dirt road leading back to the house, the sun had already dropped behind the western woods. The half-moon rock sat in shadow, calm as any other day. He ate canned soup and bread for dinner. At 8, the dogs barked twice, then stopped. Cole stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand. A rabbit shot across the yard and vanished behind the hay shed. He let out a breath, almost annoyed by how ordinary it was. The night passed. The log house cracked as the temperature dropped. The heater kicked on and shut off. The forest out there did nothing to prove Gerald right. On Saturday morning, the sheep were still all there. The fences still held. The dogs ran along the yard, fighting over an old bone. Dale fed the sheep, slowly, as always. Cole asked if he had seen anything strange. Dale looked at him, then toward the west. "Strange is something you have to hear before it becomes a thing," he said. Cole frowned. Dale only shrugged and poured feed into the trough. That sentence followed Cole back into the house, but not long enough to beat the numbers. He opened his notebook and added another line. Week 2 without offering. Normal. This time, he underlined it once. The pen dragged across the paper with a small, decisive scratch. And in that moment, Cole Whitaker allowed himself a half-smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found solid ground under his feet again. He had no malice toward Gerald. He loved him the way men in the Whitaker family usually loved each other. Awkwardly, quietly, by fixing doors, changing oil, sending money when it was needed. But love did not mean carrying on every habit without asking what it cost. Gerald had been old. Gerald had lived alone too long. A ranch could make a person believe in private rules if all year long he only talked to sheep, dogs, and trees. Cole put his grandfather's brown notebook into the desk drawer. For the first time since he had come back, he did not leave it on the desk. He put his own notebook in its place, opened to the page recording 2 normal weeks, then pulled the laptop closer. Winter needed a plan. The roof needed money. The sheep needed steady care. A rock could not be the operating center of 300 acres. That morning was beautiful, in the way Montana can be beautiful at the end of September. Pale blue sky, yellow tips on the grass. The bitter roots are shining clean after a cold night. Cole stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, feeling as if he had slipped free from some invisible cord. He looked at the half-moon rock and did not feel afraid anymore. It was just a rock. Big, flat, strange, but still a rock. At the western tree line, the Douglas fir trunks stood motionless. Cole did not notice what was missing that morning. He had not been on the ranch long enough to know that birds usually started singing before sunlight touched the sheep barn. He had not spent enough time with the forest to tell the difference between woods quiet because of cold mist and woods quiet because everything inside them was listening. Dale Perry noticed. He stopped in the barn doorway, feed bucket in hand, his face turned toward the west. The 3 dogs lifted their heads too. One of them made a low whine in its throat, then lay down flat instead of running toward the gate the way it did most mornings. Dale said nothing to Cole. Maybe he knew speaking then would do no good. Some words can only be heard after the listener has lost the right to laugh at them. Cole finished his coffee, went back inside, and opened his winter spreadsheet. On the screen, the numbers lined up obediently. Costs, revenue, reserves, repairs, labor. Everything had its own cell. He liked that. The best version of the world was one that could be divided, labeled, checked, and fixed. Outside, the western woods stayed silent all morning. That silence did not knock on the door. It did not need Cole to notice it right away. It simply lay there, thickening little by little under the Douglas fir canopy, gathering around the half-moon rock like fog that would not lift. And while Cole began planning his first winter on the Whitaker Ranch, some very old part of the land had begun recording the change. The 4th week at the Whitaker Ranch began with a morning so clear that everything looked more normal than it really was. Mist lay low across the pasture, only ankle-high, giving the late-season yellow grass a thin silver sheen. The Bitterroot Range rose to the south, blue-gray, and the sun wasn't high enough yet to touch the western tree line. The half-moon rock sat at the edge of the grass like it did every day, cold, flat, and innocent. Cole woke early, made strong coffee, and opened his laptop right there on the table. In front of him was the winter expense sheet: roof, hay, wages, veterinary medicine, fencing materials. After 2 weeks of skipping the Friday ritual with everything still intact, his head felt clearer. Gerald's red ink notes were starting to slide back into the drawer of old habits, respectable, but ready to be stopped. The first thing different that morning was the sound that was missing. Usually, the western Douglas fir woods woke up before sunlight reached the ranch yard. Small birds called from the lower branches. Ravens answered each other somewhere far off. Sometimes the tap of a woodpecker mixed with the creek on the eastern side. Cole had heard those sounds for 3 weeks without really storing them away. Only when they were gone completely did the yard begin to feel uncomfortably wide, like someone had carried all the furniture out of a room and left you sitting in it. Cole didn't notice right away. A man newly returned from the city often needs a clearer sign before he believes the woods have changed their voice. He was still busy with emails from Missoula, the quote for the south side of the roof, and the thought that the ranch needed schedules and money, not inherited anxiety. Dale Perry noticed first. The old man came out of the barn with a feed bucket in his hand, then stopped in the middle of the yard. It was a small stop. His whole body tilted slightly toward the woods, like someone who'd noticed a familiar object sitting in the wrong place. The 3 herding dogs lifted their heads too. June's ears stood up, her muzzle pointed toward the rock. The other 2 stood close together, tails low, their eyes no longer lazy. Dale didn't rush to speak. He only stood there listening. That kind of listening irritated Cole more than any warning would have, because it made him feel like he was missing a language someone else already understood. When Cole asked what was wrong, Dale only mentioned the birds, his voice low. What he meant was that when the woods suddenly had no bird noise, they were usually saving their silence for something else. That sentence slid off Cole like rain on oilcloth. He placed it in the category of rural wisdom that gets boiled down into short lines, half deep and half vague. To him, a cold morning, a shift in pressure, or birds moving elsewhere could explain it. But Dale kept watching the woods for a long time after that. The morning passed with a slight wrongness in its rhythm. The sheep moved slower toward the trough. The ones that usually fought to stand first were pressed into clusters, heads low, ears twitching constantly. The dogs didn't run circles around the yard the way they usually did. They lay near the barn, muzzles resting on their front paws, eyes turned west. Cole saw all of it, but each detail was still small enough to blame on the weather. By noon, he wrote in his notebook, "Flock a little tense, continue monitoring." The neatness of that line helped him breathe more easily. Once something went onto paper, it seemed smaller. It became data, waiting for a larger sample, not an invisible hand at the back of his neck. On Monday afternoon, Mason came to help Cole repair the eastern fence. The young man, who usually talked too much, opened his mouth far less that day and kept glancing toward the woods, as if he'd heard someone call him. Cole noticed Mason being pulled by the silence too, but he didn't ask. Asking would mean admitting it deserved a name, so he chose to talk about gate hinges, U-nails, and 3 strands of barbed wire that needed replacing before the first snow. That night, the sheep barn was louder than usual. White bodies pushed against each other, hooves knocked against the wood floor, thin bleats bounced inside the walls. Cole pulled on his coat and went out to check, and found the flock crowded into the southeast corner, the farthest point from the tree line. He opened another trough, used his own body to force them to spread out, and checked every latch and every section of fence. No bite marks, no gap, no animal outside he could shine a light on and name. Dale stood in the barn doorway, holding Gerald's old oil lantern. The yellow light fell across his face and deepened the lines around his eyes. He didn't offer advice. His silence was heavier than speech, especially the way he looked at the sheep, like a man who'd seen this part before and knew the next part wouldn't be pleasant. By Tuesday, the woods returned a little sound in the afternoon. A few isolated bird calls, short and scattered. Cole felt relieved in a way he didn't want to admit. He checked the weather, read a few pages about birds during seasonal shifts, then told himself everything was still within the natural range. Range was a word he liked. It allowed deviations to exist before they became a crisis. Tuesday night, he woke up thinking he'd heard 3 low knocks from the west. The spacing between them was unpleasantly even. He lay still, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for a 4th. The heater downstairs kicked on. Wood inside the walls contracted in the cold, and just like that, he had an explanation. By morning, the memory of the 3 knocks had softened enough that he didn't write it down. At 2 o'clock Wednesday morning, the 3 herding dogs woke the whole house. The barking rose from the backyard, hoarse and deep, aimed straight toward the western woods. It had a strange rhythm, a violent burst, then a short break, as if they were listening for an answer. Then another burst. Cole jumped out of bed, pulled on jeans in the dark, threw on a heavy coat, and grabbed the large flashlight. The handgun was in the bedside drawer. He looked at it for 1 beat, then slipped it into his coat pocket, instead of carrying it in his hand, as if that somehow made the decision less serious. The back door opened, and cold air rushed in. The wet yard lay dim under the porch light. The 3 dogs stood at the bottom of the steps, fur raised along their spines. They were barking toward the rock, but their paws wouldn't move another step forward. That was the part Cole noticed first. Their barking was moving forward, but their bodies were backing toward the house. The flashlight swept across the grass, the fence, the hay shed, then stopped on the half-moon rock. Its surface was empty, pale gray under the beam. Behind it, the first line of Douglas firs stood like black columns. The light reached only a shallow distance before darkness swallowed it. Cole stepped down into the yard. Wet grass darkened the cuffs of his pants. Every footstep sounded clear, too clear, in a night that should have had insects, night birds, or some small noise moving through it. He walked nearly to the middle of the yard. A piece of bark flipped over in the wind, making him flinch and then get angry at himself. That anger helped him stand there a few more minutes, flashlight sweeping back and forth, jaw clenched tight. The dogs barked for almost half an hour. Then, one by one, they stopped. They weren't calm. It was more like they'd understood their barking wasn't going to change whatever was out there. June was the first to crawl under the porch. The other 2 followed. Cole bent down and shone the light into the dark space beneath the boards. 3 pairs of wet, bright eyes stared back at him, necks low, ears pinned flat. He called them, then called again. They stayed there, breathing hard. By Wednesday morning, that scene still hadn't ended. The 3 dogs wouldn't leave the crawlspace under the porch, even when Cole brought food right to the steps. Mason arrived early, saw the dogs flattened beneath the porch, and forced a laugh that died quickly when June made a low sound in her throat instead of crawling out. Dale stood near the hay shed, his face turned toward the woods. He didn't talk about birds anymore. He didn't mention the rock either. The fact that he'd stopped mentioning it made Cole uneasy. Cole spent the entire afternoon checking the western edge. He walked the fence line, looking for caught fur, claw marks, disturbed soil. There wasn't anything clear enough. A few dents in the mud could have been old sheep tracks. A small broken branch at shoulder height could have been wind. Near the half-moon rock, the grass lay flattened in a faint circle, but he'd stood there the week before. Every piece of evidence stayed suspended, refusing to become an answer. When he came back, Dale was standing in front of the little room behind the hay shed. In his hand was a canvas bag with a frayed strap. Cole saw it, but didn't understand right away. Dale walked slowly, carried the bag into the kitchen, set it on a chair, then went back to his room again. One by one, familiar objects disappeared from their places. The medicine box on the shelf, the folding knife by the bed, the spare wool sweater hanging behind the door, the small Bible with the worn spine. By Friday afternoon, Dale's decision had a complete shape. That day the sky was clear, but the air over the ranch felt heavy, the way it does before a storm. Light fell over the pasture without making the place seem brighter. Since morning, the sheep had pressed into the corner of the barn, packed together into one trembling white mass. The gate was open, and the outdoor trough was full, but they only stood against the boards, breathing fast. The 3 dogs had finally come out from under the porch, but they lay flat beneath the steps, heads turned west, eyes open. Cole stood in the yard with his work list in his coat pocket. His habit of managing things suddenly felt brittle. 3 weeks earlier, he'd still believed a day on the ranch could be divided into tasks, hours, costs, and results. That Friday morning, everything that could be written down still existed, but everything that couldn't be written down had filled the space between the house and the woods. Dale didn't argue anymore. He closed the door to his little room, locked it, then set the key on the kitchen table. Beside the key was a folded piece of paper. His old pickup was parked in front of the hay shed, with only the canvas bag and a small toolbox in the bed. Mason also left the yard early, leaving the shed door half closed and half a bundle of wire untied. Cole heard Dale's truck start while he was standing in the kitchen. The sound pulled him onto the porch. The old man sat behind the wheel, both hands set at 10 and 2, like a man getting ready to drive through bad weather. He looked at Cole through the windshield, and there was no accusation in his eyes. That made it worse than an accusation. It was the regret of a man who knew he couldn't keep someone from a mistake anymore. The truck rolled out of the yard and through the north gate. Dust rose from the dirt road, thin and pale, then faded into the afternoon light. Cole stood watching until the tailgate disappeared past the cottonwoods. The ranch yard felt wider right after that. Wider in an empty way. A person left alone suddenly hears too many things, even when there is almost no sound around him. The note Dale left was on the kitchen table, written in large, slightly leaning letters, different from Gerald's red ink, but just as urgent. I'm sorry. I worked on this ranch for 12 years. I know when to stay and when to go. This is when I go. Cole read it once, then again. On the third reading, he set the paper down, his hand still touching the edge. He remembered the 3 times he had read Gerald's first red note in the little office. That week, he had still been far enough away to think the lines were strange. Now that distance had shrunk. Birds gone quiet, dogs hiding, sheep bunching up. Dale is leaving. The signs lined up one after another, and Cole began to understand that what he'd been calling coincidence had an order of its own. He could still buy venison in time if he drove into town right away. There were still apples in the pantry. The half-moon rock was only a walk across the pasture. It was a simple thing, almost ridiculous after such a tense day. He only had to do what Gerald had done for 38 years. Cole still didn't move. He told himself he needed clearer proof. A strange footprint, an animal in the beam of the light, a reason strong enough to put 15 pounds of venison on a rock like he was paying a debt to the dark. But under those reasonable-sounding explanations was something more uncomfortable. Pride. If he brought the meat out now, he'd have to admit the last 2 weeks had been luck, not a successful test. He'd have to admit Gerald might have known something Cole had laughed at too soon. Dusk came down slowly. Cole turned on the kitchen light and let the yellow glow cover the table, the brown notebook, and Dale's note. The glass door reflected his face back at him, and beyond that reflection were the darkening yard, the sheep barn, the half-moon rock, and the western woods. He could only see himself clearly, but he felt them out there more and more with every passing minute. Inside the barn, the sheep went silent after one long bleat. The 3 dogs under the porch didn't bark. The well pump stopped humming. Gerald's log house, which usually cracked and shifted in the cold, also settled down as if it were listening. By then, the silence of the woods wasn't an absence of sound anymore. It had a body. It pressed against the windows, spread over the roof, and slipped under the porch steps where the 3 dogs lay motionless. Cole sat down at the kitchen table, Dale's note in front of him, Gerald's brown notebook beside it. For the first time since coming back to the ranch, he wished he'd asked Gerald about the rock while the old man was still alive, while the answer could still come from a human mouth instead of the woods. If you're watching this far, I only want to ask one question. That night, alone in the log house, knowing the ranch hand who'd worked there the longest had left without really explaining. The dogs wouldn't come out from under the porch, and the woods had gone completely quiet. Would you go get the venison and take it to the rock? Yes or no? Comment below. Your answer says more than you think. Now stay with me. On Saturday night, Cole Whitaker didn't sleep. He lay in Gerald's bed, in a room that smelled of old wood, muscle rub, and wool dust, his eyes open to the dark ceiling. The house around him was so still that every small sound seemed to take on its own shape. A pipe in the wall gave one dry knock. Wind pressed lightly against the west-facing window. Somewhere beneath the porch, one of the 3 herding dogs breathed hard, then held still again. Cole had been through 2 nights like that since Dale Perry left. During the day, he still worked. He checked the feed troughs, called Mason in early, patched a section of the eastern fence, and added a few more lines to his notebook. Those tasks kept his body busy. But when night came, all the daylight logic drained out of his head, like water pulling away from a creek bank, leaving slick stones and sharp things behind. The half-moon rock was out there, beneath the shadow of the western woods. He couldn't see it from the bedroom, but its position was bright in his mind. 3 straight weeks without venison. 2 normal weeks at first. Then the 4th week, birds gone quiet, dogs hiding under the porch, sheep bunching together, Dale driving away. Cole tried to arrange all of it into a natural chain, but the chain kept bending back toward the rock. At 1:48, the sound began. At first it was so thin, he thought it was wind squeezing through a gap in the roof. A low, dragging sound, far off, uneven. Then it came again, a little closer. Cole sat straight up. In the dark, his feet found the cold wood floor. He stayed like that, head lowered, listening with his whole back. The sound was coming from the west. It didn't sound like the creek. The eastern creek had its own moving rhythm, sometimes distant, sometimes close, but always brighter, wetter. This thing was dry and low, like something heavy brushing through grass, stopping, then brushing forward again. It didn't sound like wind either. Wind moved high and hit the walls in broad sheets. This sound stayed low, close to the ground, close enough that the 3 dogs beneath the porch whined deep in their throats, but still didn't bark. Cole got up. The decision didn't arrive as courage. It came after too many hours of being held inside the house by something he couldn't point to. He was used to solving problems by walking straight to them. If a footing cracked, you dug down and checked the soil. If a pipe clogged, you took it apart. If a beam sagged, you measured the load. Invisible fear was the kind of material he hated most. That night, he chose the only method he trusted: bring it into the light. He pulled on jeans, a thick sweater, and Gerald's canvas jacket. The jacket was broad in the shoulders and still smelled faintly of wood smoke. In the gun cabinet near the office, Gerald's old Winchester rested on the rack, carefully oiled, even though it hadn't been fired in a long time. Cole opened the cabinet with the key hanging under the drawer. The metal was cold under his hand. That movement made the house feel suddenly more real. Wood, steel, fingers, safety latch, things with weight. He took a headlamp, too, put in fresh batteries, and strapped it around his forehead. In the kitchen, Dale's note still lay beside the brown notebook. Cole glanced at it and avoided reading it again. If he read it one more time, he might call Dale. He might drive into town for venison, even though it was far too late. He might do what Gerald wanted without ever understanding why. Pride, exhaustion, and fear had mixed into one hard knot in his chest. Cole pushed the back door open. 2 in the morning, cold rushed against his face. The yard was wet after a night of heavy dew. The headlamp cut a narrow beam over the porch steps, the grass, the fence, then drifted west. The 3 dogs under the porch didn't come out. He heard their nails scrape softly in the dirt as they backed farther in. Cole stepped down into the yard. Wet grass brushed against his pant legs and soaked into his socks. The Winchester was heavy in both hands, but that weight steadied him. The light swept across the sheep barn. Inside, the flock wasn't bleating. They were pressed into one dim mass behind the boards, all their heads turned the same way. The western woods stood low and black beneath a moonless sky. The first Douglas fir trunks looked like burned pillars. The sound was still there. This time, Cole heard it more clearly, a slow chain of movement at the edge of the woods, not rushing, not fully showing itself. Sometimes it stopped long enough for him to think he'd imagined it. Then the grass far ahead shifted, even though the wind was blowing the other way. He walked toward the half-moon rock, not too fast. Each step made the wet soil give a soft, sucking sound. The headlamp swept across the open stretch between the house and the woods. The western fence appeared, wet strands of wire glinting. The posts Gerald had driven in years ago leaned a little, but still held firm. The half-moon rock sat outside the fence in the open grass, its flat surface lighter than the darkness around it. Cole had stood there many times in daylight. At night, the rock looked lower, wider, almost like the back of an animal lying down. He was about 10 steps from the rock when the light caught the first pair of eyes. Yellow bright, low to the ground, unblinking. Cole stopped. The rifle came up by reflex before his mind had time to name what was looking back at him. A second pair appeared off to the left, then a third to the right. The beam shook slightly with his breathing, and every time it moved, another pair of eyes appeared in the tall grass. 5, 6, 7. They weren't lined up the way they would be in a movie. They were scattered across different distances, bodies hidden in shadow and grass, only the eyes showing how wide the formation really was. Wolves. The whole pack stood between Cole and the tree line. He had seen wolves once from far away on the road up toward Idaho, just a gray shape crossing pavement and disappearing. The ones in front of him now belonged to a different world. Silent, low, focused. No wasted growling, no teeth bared for show. They stood like animals that had already calculated distance, wind direction, escape routes, and timing. Their quiet made him colder than their numbers. The lead wolf stood closest to the rock. Large, thick through the shoulders, dark gray fur around its neck. It stood at an angle, head low, eyes fixed on Cole. Another wolf shifted to the left, almost nothing, just one paw placed down, but the entire formation changed. Cole felt himself being read like a blueprint. Every open space around him had been marked. He lifted the Winchester higher. His finger touched near the trigger, then pulled back half an inch. Shooting one wolf straight on might send the rest rushing him. Firing into the air might be enough to scatter them. That was daytime thinking pushing its way into the night, cleaner and more reasonable than the situation actually was. Cole drew a breath, pointed the barrel toward the sky, and fired. The shot split the ranch yard open. Muzzle flash jumped from the barrel. The sound slammed into the woods, came back from the mountain slope, and left Cole's ears ringing. Inside the barn, the sheep surged into the boards with one hard crash. Beneath the porch, the dogs didn't bark. The quiet after the gunshot fell heavy enough to feel solid. The wolves didn't run, they only shifted. Two on the right backed up half a step, then spread farther apart. One on the left slipped out of the beam and appeared again closer to the fence. The lead wolf lowered its body, shoulders rising. The formation didn't break, it opened. It widened around him. Cole realized too late that the shot hadn't scared them. It had only told them exactly where he was, how badly he was shaking, and what his limits were. He stepped back. His heel caught a root rising out of the ground. In daylight, that root would have been easy to see, a black curve from an old fir near the rock. At night, it became a hook. Cole lost his balance, the rifle swinging sideways. His left foot slipped on wet grass. He fell backward and hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath out of his chest. The headlamp slipped off-center, sending lights spinning across grass, stone, wolf eyes, and black sky. The Winchester flew from his hand, slid to the right, and stopped 3 steps away. Those 3 steps might as well have been the whole pasture. Cole pushed himself backward on his elbows. Wet soil soaked through his jacket. A small stone dug into his palm. He didn't take his eyes off the lead wolf. It stepped out of the formation slowly, with no need to hurry. The others lowered with it. The circle tightened by tiny degrees, almost politely. That was the terrible part. The pack wasn't chaotic. It was doing its work with patience. Cole's back hit something cold and hard. The half-moon rock. He turned his head halfway, recognized the stone behind him, and understood where he was. The same rock Gerald had placed venison on every Friday for 38 years. The same flat surface Cole had left empty 3 weeks in a row. He was sitting against it like a man who'd arrived late, bringing nothing that had been asked for, only a rifle that had already fallen out of his hands. The lead wolf stopped about 15 feet away. Its breath made pale white streams in the cold. Its eyes no longer merely reflected the light. They seemed to hold a deep yellow of their own inside the dark. Its front legs spread slightly, shoulders low. Muscle moved beneath the fur. The space between them was only wet grass and a very short amount of time. Cole tried to reach for the Winchester. His fingertips scraped dirt and came up short. He dragged himself another inch, his back grinding against the stone. The wolf placed one paw forward. The movement was small, but final. It was getting ready to spring. The western woods made a sound. It didn't come like an explosion. It rose, low, wide, thick, moving through the ground before Cole's ears fully understood what he was hearing. The rock behind him trembled faintly. His chest trembled too, as if a huge hand had been placed over his sternum and pressed down. It wasn't like any bear roar he'd ever heard in a video. It wasn't a scream, a howl, or any predator sound he knew. There was something older inside it, something that didn't need to raise its voice to make everything stop. The wolves froze. They didn't jump and scatter. They stopped as if movement had been cut out of them. The lead wolf held itself halfway into the lunge, one front paw still slightly raised above the grass. Its ears turned toward the woods. The others turned their heads too, each pair of yellow eyes leaving Cole and fixing on the darkness behind the rock. Cole didn't breathe. For years afterward, when he told the story of that night, he would say that this was the moment he understood how small his gunshot had been. It had echoed across the whole valley, but it was only the sound of a strange object hitting the floor. The sound from the woods was different. It had a right to be there. It didn't ask for space. It filled space that had belonged to it long before the log house, fences, and deed papers ever existed. Behind the Douglas firs, the darkness began to change shape. At first, Cole thought the crooked headlamp beam had tricked his eyes. A black mass separated from the tree trunks, far above the height of any man. Then, a low branch moved, not because of wind. Grass at the tree line bent under the force of something large passing through. A heavy, damp, wild smell entered the yard. Rotting earth, wet fur, bark, and something like warm breath from a cave. The wolves took half a step back. Cole still had his back pressed to the rock, his hand muddy, his mouth so dry it hurt. He could feel the rifle somewhere to his right, but the thought of picking it up had lost all force. There are moments when human beings know their tools are no longer the answer, even when the tool is still in sight. That night, beneath the half-moon rock, Cole learned that with his whole body. The dark mass behind the trees came closer. One trunk after another hid and revealed a shape far too large to belong to a man. Broad shoulders, a head held low beneath the branches, long arms hanging at its sides. There was no clear sound of footsteps, only grass giving way and soil taking weight. Cole stared without blinking. Everything Dale had never quite said, every red ink line Gerald had ever written, everything Cole had called superstition for 3 weeks, all rose together into his throat. He was exactly where Gerald had warned him not to be. The cold rock pressed against his back. In front of him, the wolf pack waited. Behind them, the woods opened for something coming closer. Cole wanted to close his eyes, but he couldn't. He understood, with a cruel kind of clarity, that whatever was happening tonight hadn't begun with the wolves. It had begun the first Friday he left the rock empty. In his engineer's mind, everything had always needed a bearing point. A load set on a foundation, water pressure inside a pipe, the deflection of a steel beam. In that second, the only bearing point left was the stone against his back. It was so cold, it cut through the jacket, like an old hand reminding him that some foundations aren't drawn on plans. Gerald had understood that. Dale had understood it too. Cole was only beginning to pay the price of understanding, and the woods still weren't in any hurry. And now, the woods had sent someone to look directly at the new Whitaker heir. It stepped out of the woods with a slowness that made even the wolves stand still. Before that, Cole had still thought darkness was just the empty space between Douglas fir trunks. But when that low sound moved through the ground, that emptiness began to carry weight. Grass at the tree line bent in sections. A low fir branch snapped lightly back into place. Behind the first row of trees, a black mass separated from the shadows, so large that Cole's mind needed several seconds to accept that it was moving on two legs. The creature stood more than 9 feet tall. In the crooked beam of the headlamp across the grass and the thin light of a moonless night, Cole saw it in pieces before the full body came into view. Shoulders as wide as a barn door, a thick chest, long arms hanging nearly to its knees, dark brown-black fur hanging in wet clumps across its shoulders and arms. Each step came down almost silently, with only the grass shifting aside and the mud taking its weight in a soft, heavy give. Its size wasn't what froze Cole. He had seen excavators, steel beams, large livestock, things big enough to make a person step back on instinct. But what stood before him went beyond big in another way. It moved through the land as if every yard, fence, stone, and tree had known it for a long time. Cole, sitting on the ground at the base of the half-moon rock, was the late arrival, the heir standing in the wrong place, inside a house he hadn't built. The wolves felt that before he did. The lead wolf stood in the grass, body low, yellow eyes fixed on the creature. A small movement ran along its spine, from shoulders to tail. The others shifted too. The circle around Cole lost its pressure for one beat, like a rope being loosened. The creature stopped about 20 paces from the rock. It still hadn't looked at Cole. Its amber eyes rested on the wolf pack, calm and heavy. The low sound from the woods still hung inside Cole's chest, and maybe it still sat in the bones of every wolf there. There was no threatening motion, no charge, only a massive body standing exactly on the boundary. The lead wolf backed away first. One step, then another, its head lowered like an animal that had just met something higher in the old order of the woods. The others backed away with it, gray shapes withdrawing from the ring. The whole pack moved in an orderly line north, slipping into the tall grass and then disappearing beneath the trees. Like a hunting party that had been ordered to retreat, Cole heard their paws fade. Then the ranch yard held only his breathing and the blood moving in his ears. The creature turned its head. Those amber eyes dropped down to Cole from above. For years afterward, Cole would remember the feeling of that second more clearly than any image. His back was still pressed against the cold rock. His right hand was full of mud. Gerald's Winchester lay in the wet grass 3 steps away, but it now belonged to a smaller world. Cole looked into those eyes, and fear changed shape. The wolves had threatened his body. This gaze touched the part of him he had used to excuse himself for 3 weeks. It understood, not in the way an animal understands danger, That look was deep enough to pull into the open everything Cole had thought only existed between him and the spreadsheet. The moment he closed the refrigerator door on the wrapped venison, the black ink note in his own notebook, the little smile when the second week passed normally, the way he had put Gerald's brown notebook into the drawer like something outdated, all of it was inside that silent stare, cleaner than any report. Cole had believed evidence had to leave marks. Fur, tracks, blood, photographs, claw scars on a fence. Now he understood that some evidence doesn't sit on the ground. Birds gone silent all morning, dogs hiding under the porch, Dale leaving, sheep pressed into the corner of the barn, wolves standing directly between him and the woods like the most natural punishment for a forgotten agreement. Each sign had arrived softly. He had simply refused to put them together. The creature didn't seem angry. Cole had prepared himself for anger because anger was easier to understand. Roaring, striking the rock, charging him, driving him off the ranch. At least those things would let him play the role of the survivor. But that gaze didn't give him that comfort. It carried something heavier. Disappointment. The disappointment of one side that had held up its part for too long. Then met the new man who didn't understand the value of what had been handed down. That night, if anyone had asked Cole what made him feel smallest, he would have said those 20 seconds of being watched. 20 seconds were enough for 10 years of education, an engineering degree, a habit of control, and every winter spreadsheet to drain out of him like muddy water. What remained was him, leaning against the rock, a grandson who had been given the rules, but not the humility to read them. Victor has always paused at this part, because by now the story isn't really about what that creature was. The more important thing is the rock and the notebook written in red ink. Gerald Whitaker never recorded the first time the bargain began. No page says how he met it in 1986, or what made him bring venison out on that first Friday. The notebook begins after the decision had already been made. Friday, Half Moon Rock, fresh deer, no less than 15 pounds, seasonal fruit. Do not be late, do not miss it. When Cole read that line in the first week, it looked like a superstitious order. Under the amber gaze that night, it became something else. Survival instructions, a reminder of a boundary, and a way of admitting that land doesn't only belong to the person whose name is on the papers. Some agreements don't need signatures because they've been repeated long enough to become the rhythm of a place. One side places food on the right day. The other keeps wolves outside the property line, keeps sheep safe in the barn, keeps the western woods at just enough distance for the lights in the log house to stay on through winter. Gerald wasn't bribing an animal. He was taking part in an order that existed before he ever built a fence. Every Friday, he walked out to that rock like a man who knew he was living on the edge of a much larger territory. Cole understood that very late. The creature watched him for a few more breaths. Its breath stretched into a pale cloud in the cold. Water still clung to the fur across its shoulders. A long, pale scar crossed the left side of its chest and disappeared beneath the thick coat. Cole saw it when the crooked beam of the headlamp swept across it. That scar made the creature less like a legend and more frightening in another way. It had been hurt. It had lived through old seasons. It had returned to this place long enough to know how each generation of Whitakers changed. Then it turned away, not quickly. It didn't need to make a point. One large foot settled into the grass, then its back turned toward Cole, both shoulders moving toward the trees. That motion scared him more than any roar could have. If it had attacked, at least he would have understood the story in a simple way. It left, and in that leaving, there was a quiet sentence. It had seen enough. Gerald's new heir didn't understand the agreement, didn't respect the ritual, and only remembered the gun when the woods demanded an answer. It didn't look back. The wolves were gone. The ranch yard opened around him, empty, but Cole no longer felt safe. He sat at the base of the rock, legs numb from the cold, jacket wet with mud, mouth dry. The Winchester still lay to his right. He could reach for it and stand up, but his hand didn't move. In that moment, the rifle looked almost rude, a small, noisy thing in a night belonging to things older than people. The woods closed behind the creature with darkness and moving grass. Only the absence of that huge body remained, heavy enough that when it disappeared, the whole yard seemed to sink slightly. Cole sat there for a long time. Cold seeped through his back from the stone. His knees hurt from hitting the ground. The headlamp lay sideways beside him, its light weakening into a yellow strip across the grass. He thought of Gerald at 30 years old, maybe standing in front of this same rock with shaking hands. He thought of the old man years later, wrist hurting, still carrying the venison out himself before sunset. The night stretched so long that Cole couldn't tell what hour it was anymore. The sheep barn stayed quiet. The dogs remained under the porch. Every now and then, wind pushed a blade of grass against his pant leg. He didn't sleep, and he didn't really think in a straight line. Memory and red ink notes drifted through him slowly. Wolves west didn't enter our land. Kendall lost 12 cattle. The bargain still holds. Every line now had a face, breath, amber eyes. When the first light leaked over the eastern trees, Cole finally stood. His legs were stiff, his hands scraped raw. He picked up the Winchester, unloaded it, and carried it back to the house in both hands, with the barrel pointed toward the ground. On the porch, the 3 dogs crawled out from beneath the boards when he came near. They didn't greet him happily. They only sniffed his pant legs, the mud and forest smell, then lay down close to the door. Cole went into Gerald's office. The brown notebook was still in the drawer. He placed it on the desk and opened to the final blank page. For a long time, he only looked at the paper. Then he searched the pencil cup for the red pen Gerald had used. The ink was almost dry, and he had to shake it several times before it would flow. The first stroke trembled, but he didn't stop. He wrote the first sentence of his life in that red ink. Friday, Half Moon Rock. Do not be late. Do not miss it. When he finished, Cole laid the pen sideways across the page. Outside the window, the Half Moon Rock began to appear in the gray morning light. For the first time since coming back to the ranch, he didn't see it as a strange object on his property. It was a meeting place, a boundary, the place where Gerald had stood between the Whitaker family and something far larger than the Whitaker family. And from that morning on, Cole never called those 15 pounds of venison an expense again. I keep coming back to 2 words Gerald Whitaker once said to Cole when Cole was little. Land rent. The first time you hear it, it sounds like a joke, from an old man who'd spent too much of his life around sheep, fences, and dark woods. But after the night Cole leaned against the Half Moon Rock and watched a wolf pack retreat before a creature over 9 feet tall, those 2 words changed completely. Gerald wasn't paying rent to a landowner on paper. He was admitting that part of that land didn't belong to the Whitaker family, no matter what the deed said. We're used to thinking ownership is a line on a map. Whoever buys it, signs for it, and pays taxes on it has the right to it. But people who live close to the woods long enough often understand another layer. They know some things don't need paperwork to hold boundaries clearly. Wolves travel by the paths wolves know. Creeks rise according to their own seasons. Trees fall where their roots have grown tired. Gerald saw that in 1986. Instead of trying to drive something larger than himself out of the woods, he chose to live beside it. Every Friday, 15 pounds of venison and a little fruit weren't just food. They were a repeated greeting, a sentence spoken through action. We know you're here, and we haven't forgotten. What hurts me in this story is that Cole wasn't a bad man. He was a man of the newer generation, used to spreadsheets, costs, efficiency, and tasks you could cross off. He read his grandfather's notebook the way you'd read an outdated operating manual. He stopped the ritual because he thought he was correcting a small flaw in the system. Cole's real mistake was that he stopped too quickly. He didn't sit with the question long enough. Why would a man as practical as Gerald do the same thing for 38 years? In ecology, there's a concept called mutualism, a relationship that benefits both sides. One real-world example I always remember is the relationship between Yao honey hunters in Mozambique and honey guide birds. The Yao use special calls to invite the birds to lead them. The birds guide them to beehives. The humans take the honey and open the hive, and the birds eat the wax and larvae left behind. Modern studies have shown that honey guides respond more strongly to the familiar signals of local hunters, meaning that relationship isn't just coincidence. It's a learned form of communication between people and wild animals. I'm not saying the Whitaker Ranch is exactly the same as the story of the Yao. One is real research, and one is the deep wood story we've just walked through. But they point toward the same old idea. Human beings once knew how to live through small agreements with nature, the right signal, the right portion, the right day. And when the next generation inherits the land, but not the listening, that agreement can break without anyone meaning harm. It probably wouldn't be fair to blame Cole completely. Gerald left the notebook, but he didn't tell the story of the first time. Dale knew something was wrong, but his warning came late and stayed too vague. Older people sometimes keep secrets so long they forget the young can't inherit understanding through a few underlined red sentences. Cole was wrong to dismiss it, but he'd also been left with a puzzle and no key. To me, the lesson tonight is in the pause before tearing down something old. Not every tradition is right. Plenty of old things need to be changed, and some need to end. But if something has been repeated through 38 winters by a man who was never known for superstition, we ought to slow down a little, ask one more question, look a little closer. Sometimes, what looks like superstition is survival knowledge, with the explanation missing. Now I want to know what you think. If you believe Sasquatch is real, or you believe the woods still hold agreements people don't fully understand, comment, Sasquatch is real. And if you're listening from Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, or anywhere near deep forest, comment your state. I want to know how many of you tonight are close enough to dark trees to understand why Cole was afraid. And before you turn off the screen, ask yourself this slowly. If there were a rock like that on your land, would you see it as a burden or as a reminder to live more carefully with the night woods? Thank you for staying until the end of the story. Remember, some agreements are written not in ink, but in the silence of the woods. I am Victor, and I'll see you in the next story.